The 6 Hidden Dangers of Seeing What Others Don't. Vertical bar, Carl Jung. What if the very thing that makes you special also makes you dangerous? Carl Jung revealed that seeing what others cannot is both a gift and a curse. It can isolate you, destabilize you, and even make the world turn against you, but it can also become your greatest strength. Today, we dive deep into the hidden dangers of vision shadow and the lonely path of awakening. Part 1. The burden of knowing beyond the crowd. Human beings are wired to live in tribes. From the earliest days of humanity, belonging to a group meant survival. Food, safety, and emotional support all depended on a shared sense of reality. This instinct did not vanish as civilization advanced, it simply changed shape. Today, the tribe is the collective consciousness of society, the beliefs, norms, and values that most people hold. Carl Jung emphasized that the individual ego is always surrounded by, and often constrained by, the collective unconscious, the inherited reservoir of archetypes and cultural patterns that guide behavior. For most people, this alignment with collective norms provides security. But what happens to the individual who begins to see what others cannot? To see beyond the veil is not just a gift, it is also a burden. Jung understood this as the conflict between the ego consciousness and the unconscious realities that seep through in dreams, visions, or sudden insights. When a person becomes aware of truths or contradictions that the collective has not acknowledged, they step outside the safety of the shared worldview. And the first thing they encounter is resistance both from within themselves and from those around them. The isolation of vision. Seeing what others do not often creates an invisible wall. Imagine someone who notices the hypocrisy in social systems, the hidden motives in relationships, or the patterns of manipulation in politics. These insights are not always welcome. Jung noted that the collective psyche resists change, just as the body resists foreign invaders. A new idea, especially one that exposes shadow material, is treated as a threat. The visionary becomes the outsider. This is why prophets, mystics, and reformers across history faced rejection. They disturbed the comfort of the herd by pointing to truths others were not ready to digest. Psychologically, this reflects the herd instinct in the human psyche, the drive to conform to the group. To deviate from that instinct produces both social punishment and deep personal anxiety. Jung remarked that loneliness does not come from being alone, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you. The person who sees differently feels that distance in every conversation, in every silence where understanding fails to arrive. Knowledge as a double-edged sword. The deeper one sees into the unconscious, the more weight one carries. Jung described knowledge of the unconscious as numbing if it cannot be integrated. To see collective illusions such as the pursuit of status, the denial of mortality, or the repression of instincts can make daily life feel artificial. While others chase wealth recognition or surface pleasures, the individual who perceives deeper motives may feel detached, even alienated. This detachment has consequences. On one hand, it can foster wisdom, the ability to live without being enslaved by illusions. On the other hand, it can create bitterness and cynicism if the individual fails to translate insight into meaningful life. Jung often emphasized the importance of individuation, the process of integrating unconscious contents into conscious life, as the only way to bear the burden of unusual perception. Without this, awareness corrodes rather than liberates the ego and the collective unconscious. To understand why seeing beyond others is so dangerous, we must return to Jung's idea of the collective unconscious. Unlike personal unconscious material, repressed memories, forgotten experiences, the collective unconscious contains archetypes, universal patterns of thought and behavior shared across humanity. These archetypes, such as the hero, the mother, the trickster, the shadow, shape cultures and individual psyches alike. Most people live within the unconscious influence of these archetypes without realizing it. Their dreams, stories, religions, and politics are saturated with them. But the person who begins to recognize archetypal patterns consciously steps into a different relationship with them. They start to see myths playing out in daily life, shadow dynamics in the news, or anima divided by animus projections in love relationships. While this awareness can be empowering, it also destabilizes the ordinary sense of reality. Think of it this way: to live entirely within the collective unconscious is to swim in water without knowing you are wet. To become conscious of the water is to suddenly feel the pressure, the weight, the currents. That awareness can be suffocating. The ordinary person remains blissfully submerged. The awakened individual realizes they are drowning. The archetype of the outsider, Jung suggested that certain individuals embody the archetype of the outsider or the seer. These are figures who, by temperament or fate, cannot help but perceive what the group ignores. In myths, these are often shamans, oracles, or prophets. In modern times, they may be psychologists, artists, or scientists who break conventions. Their role is paradoxical. Society needs them to evolve, but also fears and rejects them. This rejection can be subtle. It may come in the form of ridicule, labeling the visionary as crazy or dismissing their concerns as paranoia. Or it may be violent, as history has shown with the persecution of reformers and revolutionaries. Jung himself, though widely respected, faced criticism for venturing into areas that blurred the line between psychology and mysticism. Yet he insisted that the psyche contained spiritual dimensions, and ignoring them would cripple human understanding. The burden of language and communication. Another danger lies in the difficulty of translating deep perception into language. Jung observed that the unconscious often communicates through symbols, dream images, myths, and archetypal motifs. The person who sees differently must find words to express realities that do not fit ordinary categories. This can create misunderstandings. When someone speaks of archetypal patterns, others may hear superstition or irrationality. This communication gap deepens the burden. The visionary feels trapped between two worlds, the inner world rich with symbolic truth and the outer world bound by rational language. To bridge this gap requires not only insight but also artistry. Jung himself resorted to myth alchemy and religious symbolism to convey psychological truths. Without such symbolic translation, the danger is twofold. Either the visionary retreats into silence, suffocating under unspoken truths, or they speak in ways that alienate others further. The collective's defense mechanisms. Why does society resist those who see differently? Jung would argue it is because the collective psyche has its own form of self-preservation. Just as an individual ego defends itself against threatening unconscious material through repression and denial, the collective ego defends itself through ridicule, censorship, and punishment. When someone exposes the hidden shadow of the group, be it corruption, hypocrisy, or violence, the group projects that shadow back onto the whistleblower. They become the scapegoat carrying the sins of the collective. This is not accidental. It is a psychological necessity. The group cannot yet bear to integrate its own darkness, so it casts it onto the one who dared to reveal it. This is why Jung insisted that confronting the collective shadow requires immense strength. It is not simply an intellectual act, but a spiritual ordeal. The danger is not only external hostility, but also internal fragmentation. The individual must withstand both the fury of the group and the chaos unleashed within themselves by seeing too much too soon. Historical parallels. Throughout history, individuals who saw beyond the collective suffered this burden. Socrates, condemned for corrupting the youth of Athens, challenged conventional wisdom. Galileo, punished for his observations, disrupted the church's cosmology. Mystics across traditions were branded heretics for experiencing God outside official doctrine. Jung's framework helps us see these not as random injustices, but as archetypal patterns. The fate of the seer is to carry knowledge others cannot yet integrate. The psychological danger is that the visionary may internalize the group's rejection. They may begin to doubt their sanity, suppress their insights, or isolate themselves to the point of despair. Jung warned of this risk. To see more deeply than others can bear is to flirt with madness, unless the insights are grounded in symbolic and communal frameworks that provide meaning. The necessity of integration. The burden of unusual vision is not meant to crush the individual but to challenge them toward integration. Jung argued that the psyche seeks wholeness. If one sees what others do, the task is not merely to escape the collective, but to learn how to live with both realities. This requires individuation, the conscious process of uniting opposites within the psyche. Only through individuation can the visionary avoid being torn apart by the conflict between personal insight and collective denial. In individuation, the individual learns to balance solitude with engagement, inner truth with outer reality. They accept that not everyone can or should see what they see. Instead of forcing others to awaken, they learn to embody the truth quietly, letting their life become a symbol rather than a sermon. In this way, the burden becomes less destructive and more transformative. Part 2. The Shadow of Vision and Existential Loneliness. To see what others do not is not simply an intellectual act. It carries with it an existential cost. Jung believed that true perception often comes with suffering because it separates the individual from the comfort of the herd. The price of vision is loneliness. Not the surface-level loneliness of lacking company, but a deeper existential loneliness that comes from standing in a space where others cannot follow. The experience of loneliness as a psychological reality. Loneliness in this sense is not merely being without people. One may be surrounded by family, friends, or colleagues and still feel utterly isolated. This form of loneliness is the recognition that the inner world no longer aligns with the collective outer world. Jung described this condition as the burden of the awakened soul to perceive truths that others either deny or cannot yet comprehend. When one begins to see shadow dynamics, the hidden motives, the suppressed instincts, the archetypal patterns, ordinary conversation becomes strained. Small talk feels hollow, surface-level goals feel trivial, and cultural rituals appear like performances without substance. The individual feels estranged not just from people but from the very fabric of society. This is existential loneliness, and it can weigh heavier than any physical isolation. The archetype of the wanderer mythology is filled with figures who embody this kind of loneliness: the wanderer, the exile, the prophet in the desert. Jung interpreted these stories not as literal history, but as archetypal representations of psychological states. The wanderer archetype appears when an individual is forced away from the safety of the tribe and sent into the wilderness. Moses on the mountain, Buddha under the Bodhi tree, Christ in the desert. These figures symbolize the same process. They withdrew from collective life not because they hated it, but because they had to digest truths that no one else was ready for. The desert, the wilderness, the mountain, these are symbols of the psychic space where one confronts loneliness. Jung believed that such isolation was not a punishment, but a necessary stage of individuation. Yet while it leads to growth, it feels like exile. Social rejection as projection of the collective shadow. Existential loneliness is often intensified by the reaction of others. Jung noted that when someone perceives shadow truths, the group instinctively resists. They may laugh, dismiss, or even attack. The collective cannot admit its own darkness, so it projects that darkness onto the seer. The individual who notices corruption is called paranoid. The one who speaks of spiritual realities is branded delusional. The one who questions authority is punished as a threat. This rejection does more than isolate it, compounds loneliness with self-doubt. To be told repeatedly that what you see is false, even when you know it is true, produces a profound inner conflict. Jung called this the tension of opposites, the conflict between personal perception and collective denial. If unresolved, it may lead the individual to repress their vision, suppressing the very gift that set them apart. The inner dialogue of the awakened soul. The danger of existential loneliness is that it turns inward. Jung observed that the psyche is never silent. When deprived of outer resonance, it speaks more loudly from within. For the isolated seer, this can become both blessing and curse. Dreams intensify, archetypal imagery erupts, synchronicities multiply. The inner world becomes alive, but without proper grounding it can overwhelm. The inner dialogue may sound like madness to the outside world. Visions, symbols, and intuitions flow in ways that are difficult to explain. Jung insisted that these experiences are not pathological in themselves. They are the psyche's attempt to balance consciousness with the unconscious. Yet the loneliness of having no one to share them with makes them feel like hallucinations. Integration requires recognizing these inner voices as part of the self, not as intrusions from beyond. The pain of misunderstanding. Perhaps the sharpest edge of this loneliness is the pain of being misunderstood. To express a vision only to be met with blank stares or worse mockery wounds the psyche. Jung believed that misunderstanding is inevitable when language fails to capture the depth of symbolic experience. The seer speaks of archetypes while the listener hears superstition. The seer speaks of patterns while the listener hears paranoia. Over time, this repeated experience of misunderstanding can produce a defensive shell. The visionary may withdraw into silence, choosing solitude over humiliation. But solitude easily slides into bitterness if it is not accompanied by a sense of purpose. Jung emphasized that the solution is not to abandon the collective entirely, but to learn how to live with both realities, the inner vision and the outer world. Loneliness. As a stage of individuation, Jung reframed loneliness not as a permanent curse, but as a stage in the process of individuation. To individuate means to become whole by integrating the unconscious with the conscious. This process inevitably separates the individual from collective norms, because one must stop living only by what everyone else believes and begin to live by inner truth. During this separation, loneliness becomes acute. It is the void created when the old collective identity dissolves, but the new individuated identity has not yet fully emerged. Jung compared this to the alchemical stage of Nigredo, the dark night of dissolution before transformation. In loneliness, the old self dies, and the seeds of the new self are sown. The temptation of escape. The burden of loneliness often tempts individuals to escape. Some numb themselves with distractions, work, entertainment, substances. Others regress into conformity, silencing their vision just to belong again. Jung warned that this regression is spiritually dangerous. To deny the vision is to betray the self, and betrayal of the self leads to neurosis. The psyche rebels when its truth is denied, and symptoms emerge: anxiety, depression, or compulsive behavior. The other temptation is to romanticize loneliness, to see oneself as superior to the collective. This too is dangerous, for it inflates the ego. Jung cautioned that the visionary must avoid both despair and arrogance. True individuation requires humility, recognizing that one's vision is not a personal possession, but a glimpse of universal truth passing through. Loneliness as a gateway to depth. Paradoxically, loneliness is not only a danger, but also a doorway. In solitude, the psyche reveals depths that cannot be accessed in the noise of the crowd. Dreams become clearer. Creativity intensifies, and inner guidance emerges. Jung himself retreated into solitude during his confrontation with the unconscious recording visions that later became the Red Book. He knew the risk of madness, but he also knew that without facing the loneliness of vision, he could not integrate the unconscious into conscious life. This is why existential loneliness, painful as it is, becomes the crucible of transformation. It strips away the false securities of belonging and forces the individual to encounter the self directly. In Jungian terms, the self is the archetype of wholeness, the inner center that transcends the ego. To meet the self requires passing through the valley of loneliness, for only there can the ego surrender its need for validation from the collective. Symbols of existential loneliness. Across cultures, symbols of loneliness appear in myths, art, and literature. The desert, the cave, the night sea journey all represent the psyche's experience of isolation. Jung interpreted these not as mere stories, but as symbolic expressions of a universal psychological process. When one sees what others do, not one enters the desert. It is barren, silent, and frightening. Yet it is also the place where revelations occur. The hero in myth often faces a night alone before transformation. This is not an accident, but an archetypal necessity. Loneliness is the threshold between the old self and the new self. Without it, no true vision is integrated. The seer must learn to walk alone before they can return to guide others. The paradox of connection through loneliness. Ironically, while loneliness feels like separation, it also creates a deeper form of connection. The visionary realizes that their isolation is not unique but archetypal. Many before them, poets, mystics, reformers, have walked the same path. Jung emphasized the importance of recognizing this archetypal pattern because it transforms loneliness from a personal failure into a universal journey. When one sees loneliness in this way, it becomes less unbearable. It is not I alone suffer, but I am walking the path that all seekers walk. This recognition creates an invisible community across time, connecting the individual with the lineage of all who dared to see differently. Part 3. Conflict with the collective shadow. To see what others do not is not only a personal burden, it also sets up an inevitable clash with the collective psyche. Jung described this conflict in terms of the shadow, the dark, repressed aspect of both individuals and societies. When a person dares to notice, expose, or even live in awareness of the shadow, they activate powerful defense mechanisms in the group. The collective cannot bear its own hidden darkness, so it fights back against the one who reveals it. The nature of the collective shadow. The shadow is not limited to individual psychology. Just as an individual represses unwanted traits into the unconscious, societies repress undesirable realities into the collective unconscious. In individuals, this might include anger, envy, lust, or fear. In societies, the shadow can take the form of injustice, oppression, greed, and violence, things the culture denies while still enacting them in hidden ways. Jung insisted that the shadow is not inherently evil, it is simply what has been denied. But because it is denied, it becomes distorted. When a society represses its aggression, it may erupt in wars. When it represses sexuality, it may manifest in scandal and abuse. The collective shadow always finds expression, and those who see it are often the first to be blamed. Projection, as collective defense projection, is one of the most powerful psychological mechanisms Jung identified. It occurs when an individual attributes their own unwanted traits to others. On the collective level, entire groups engage in projection. Instead of admitting to corruption, a society projects corruption onto outsiders. Instead of admitting violence, it calls its wars peacekeeping. When someone exposes these projections, they themselves become the target. The group unconsciously projects the shadow onto the seer, labeling them as dangerous, immoral, or insane. The whistleblower becomes the scapegoat. Jung saw this scapegoating as archetypal. The group needs someone to carry its disowned darkness, and the one who sees most clearly becomes the chosen victim. Historical patterns of scapegoating. The archetype of the scapegoat is as old as civilization. Ancient rituals literally placed the sins of the tribe onto an animal or person who was then expelled or sacrificed. In modern times, the ritual continues symbolically. Dissidents, prophets, reformers, and innovators are cast out for disturbing the collective order. Socrates was executed for corrupting the youth of Athens. Galileo was condemned for challenging the church's cosmology. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated for exposing America's racial shadow. Each of these figures confronted the collective shadow, and each paid the price. Jung's framework reveals the psychological pattern beneath these events. Societies cannot tolerate those who expose their unconscious darkness, so they eliminate them rather than integrate the truth. The danger of archetypal confrontation. When an individual confronts the collective shadow, they are not merely facing opinions or disagreements. They are touching archetypal energy, which is vastly more powerful than personal psychology. Jung warned that archetypes, once activated, carry numinous energy. They feel divine, overwhelming, larger than life. To confront the collective shadow is to awaken the archetype of the enemy, and once activated, the group reacts with a primitive, almost religious fury. This is why reformers are rarely treated rationally. They are demonized, caricatured, and sometimes literally dehumanized. The group does not see them as individuals, but as embodiments of evil. Jung would say that the archetype of the shadow has been projected onto them, turning them into symbols of what the collective cannot accept in itself. The individual's inner struggle. The conflict with the collective shadow does not only play out externally. The individual must also grapple with their own inner shadow. To expose the shadow of society, one must first confront the same dynamics within oneself. Otherwise, projection becomes mutual. The reformer projects their own unacknowledged darkness onto the group just as the group projects onto them. Jung cautioned that this double projection leads to fanaticism and paranoia. The challenge then is immense. The visionary must differentiate between what belongs to them and what belongs to the collective. They must ask, am I truly seeing the shadow of society, or am I projecting my own unresolved material? Without this inner clarity, the conflict with the collective becomes destructive rather than transformative. The role of the trickster archetype. Jung often pointed to the trickster archetype as a figure that destabilizes order by exposing hypocrisy. Trickster energy manifests in satire, irony, and humor, ways of revealing the shadow without direct confrontation. In some cultures, jesters or clowns were allowed to say what others could not precisely because their role was sanctioned. However, when an individual embodies trickster energy outside of sanctioned roles, they risk punishment. The truth teller who speaks without protection is vulnerable. Jung would note that this reflects the ambivalence of the trickster, both necessary and dangerous, both liberating and destructive. The conflict with the collective shadow often revolves around this tension. How much truth can be spoken before the group retaliates? Psychological consequences of confrontation. The visionary who confronts the collective shadow pays a peerless psychological price. Constant opposition, ridicule, or persecution can erode self-confidence. Jung observed that many who carry shadow awareness fall into depression or cynicism. Some collapse under the pressure, silencing themselves. Others grow rigid and dogmatic, consumed by the very darkness they opposed. The healthiest path, Jung argued, lies in maintaining symbolic awareness. One must recognize that the battle is not only social or political but archetypal. To fight the shadow is not to destroy it but to integrate it. The goal is not to annihilate the collective darkness but to bring it into consciousness where it can be transformed. Modern expressions of the conflict. In today's world, the conflict with the collective shadow appears in multiple arenas. Whistleblowers who expose corruption in corporations or governments often face exile or imprisonment. Activists who highlight systemic injustice are demonized as extremists. Even in personal relationships, those who point out hidden dysfunctions in families or communities are labeled troublemakers. Social media amplifies this dynamic. The collective shadow can be projected at scale, turning individuals into viral scapegoats overnight. Online mobs embody archetypal forces, unleashing collective rage that feels disproportionate to the offense. Jung would recognize this as the eruption of shadow energy through the digital collective unconscious. The necessity of courage. To withstand the conflict with the collective shadow requires courage. Jung emphasized that individuation is not for the faint of heart. It demands the strength to endure rejection, the humility to face one's own darkness, and the wisdom to speak truth without being consumed by it. The danger is real. History shows that many who confronted the collective shadow perished. Yet Jung insisted that without such confrontation, societies stagnate. Progress requires individuals willing to bear the conflict. Transformation through shadow work. The ultimate purpose of shadow confrontation is transformation. Jung believed that both individuals and societies grow by integrating what has been repressed. When someone exposes the shadow, they offer an opportunity for collective healing. But this opportunity is rarely welcomed at first. It comes wrapped in conflict, resistance, and pain. The visionary who survives the conflict without collapsing or inflating becomes a symbol of wholeness. They embody the possibility of living with the shadow, consciously neither denying it nor being destroyed by it. In this sense, the conflict with the collective shadow, though dangerous, is also profoundly creative. It plants the seeds of future consciousness, even if the seer themselves does not live to see the harvest. Part 4. The risk of psychological imbalance. To see what others do not is not only socially dangerous, it is psychologically perilous. Jung repeatedly warned that confronting the unconscious without proper preparation can destabilize the psyche. The human mind is not built to hold unlimited awareness. Consciousness is fragile, and when it collides with archetypal realities too vast or too numinous, the result can be imbalance, fragmentation, or even psychosis. The visionary must walk a razor's edge between awakening and disintegration, between illumination and madness. The fragility of consciousness. Consciousness, Jung argued, is like a small island floating on the vast ocean of the unconscious. For most people, this island is protected by cultural norms, routines, and shared beliefs. These structures act as breakwaters, shielding the ego from overwhelming unconscious contents. But when an individual begins to see beyond what others see, those protections weaken, dreams intensify, synchronicities increase, archetypal patterns become visible. The ego, once insulated, is now exposed to tidal waves from the unconscious. Without integration, these tidal waves threaten to drown the ego. This is why mystics, shamans, and prophets across cultures often endured psychological crises. Their visions were not just poetic, they were overwhelming intrusions of the unconscious into consciousness. Jung himself experienced such a confrontation during his creative illness after his break with Freud, when he was flooded with visions that nearly shattered his stability. Only by recording them, symbolizing them, and engaging them through art and myth could he avoid collapse. Archetypal overload. The danger of seeing what others do not often lies in the sheer intensity of archetypal energy. Archetypes are not just images, they are living forces that carry a numinous charge. To encounter the shadow, the anima divided by animus, or the self, is to touch something that feels larger than life, even divine. This can elevate consciousness, but it can also overwhelm it. For example, the encounter with the self, the archetype of wholeness, can produce experiences of ecstasy, unity, and transcendence. But if the ego identifies with the self, inflation occurs. The person begins to believe they are godlike, chosen, or infallible. Jung warned that such inflation is one of the greatest dangers of individuation. The individual, overwhelmed by archetypal energy, loses perspective. What could have been transformation becomes delusion. The thin line between vision and madness. History is filled with examples of individuals who straddled the line between vision and madness. Mystics who reported divine voices, artists who painted archetypal imagery, revolutionaries who believed they were destined to transform the world, all danced near psychological imbalance. Jung argued that the difference between visionary experience and psychosis is not the content but the integration. Both may see the same archetypal images, but the visionary integrates them symbolically while the psychotic is consumed by them literally. For instance, a person who dreams of a great flood may understand it symbolically as a message about emotional overwhelm. But if taken literally, they may believe an actual flood is coming, and their life unravels around apocalyptic fear. Jung emphasized that symbolic understanding is what saves the psyche. Without it, archetypal encounters become destructive. Inflation and the Messiah complex. One of the most common dangers of psychological imbalance is inflation. When someone sees truths others do not, they may begin to believe they are uniquely chosen or superior. This is the root of the Messiah complex. Instead of recognizing that their vision reflects universal archetypes, they claim it as personal destiny. This identification with the self-archetype swells the ego to monstrous proportions. Inflated individuals often become charismatic but destructive. They attract followers, promise salvation, and interpret all opposition as proof of their special mission. History shows countless examples of such figures, from false prophets to cult leaders. Jung explained that they are not lying, they are possessed by archetypal forces they cannot control. The danger is not that they see the unconscious, but that they cannot differentiate themselves from it. Fragmentation and dissociation. The opposite danger is not inflation, but fragmentation. Some individuals overwhelmed by unconscious contents lose cohesion. Instead of one inflated ego, there are many splintered selves. This can manifest as dissociation, where the person shifts between states of consciousness without continuity. Jung recognized this in patients who felt invaded by voices, impulses, or identities that were not their own. In Jungian terms, these fragments are autonomous complexes, clusters of psychic energy that break off from the ego. Normally, complexes remain unconscious, subtly influencing behavior. But when awareness deepens, too quickly, complexes erupt into consciousness with full force. The result is disorientation, paranoia, or psychotic breaks. The visionary who cannot integrate these eruptions may end up destroyed by the very truths they uncovered. The role of symbol and ritual. To prevent psychological imbalance, Jung stressed the importance of symbols and rituals. Symbols allow unconscious contents to be expressed without overwhelming the ego. Rituals provide containers that give shape to otherwise chaotic experiences. This is why traditional societies relied on shamanic rites, religious ceremonies, and initiation practices. They acted as psychic stabilizers, helping individuals process visions safely. Modern individuals lacking such containers face greater risk. Without rituals or symbolic frameworks, archetypal experiences arrive raw and unmediated. A dream becomes an obsession, a synchronicity becomes a paranoia, a vision becomes a literal prophecy. Jung warned that without symbolic understanding, people mistake inner images for outer realities, and imbalance follows. The importance of grounding. Another safeguard against imbalance is grounding in ordinary life. Jung emphasized the need for balance between the inner and outer worlds. The visionary must still work, eat, love, and participate in daily life. Without this grounding, they drift into isolation and obsession. Jung himself gardened, carved, and built stone towers during his confrontation with the unconscious. These simple acts tethered him to reality, preventing him from being swept away. Grounding also involves relationships. Though the visionary may feel misunderstood, connection with even a few trusted individuals provides stability. Sharing visions in creative forms, art, writing, or analysis transforms private torment into collective meaning. Without such outlets, the psyche implodes under its own weight. Psychological resilience and the ego self-axis. Jung described the relationship between the ego and the self as the axis of psychological health. Too much distance and the ego is cut off from deeper meaning. Too much identification and the ego is inflated or dissolved. Health lies in maintaining a dynamic tension. The ego remains distinct but open to guidance from the self. When someone sees what others do, not this axis is stretched. The ego is pulled toward unconscious contents it cannot fully control. Resilience lies in strengthening the ego's capacity without severing its connection to the unconscious. This is why Jung valued analysis, active imagination, and dream work. These practices help individuals dialogue with the unconscious rather than drown in it. Collective denial of psychological risk. Societies often ignore the psychological dangers of vision. Prophets, artists, or dissidents who collapse under the weight of their insights are dismissed as crazy. But Jung insisted that these collapses reveal something crucial, that the psyche is not infinitely elastic. Consciousness has limits. To demand that individuals carry visions alone without symbolic or communal support is cruel. The collective benefits from their insights but abandons them to madness. This denial perpetuates tragedy. Visionaries are left unsupported, their crises untreated, their contributions dismissed. Jung believed that depth psychology's role was to provide what traditional religion once did: a symbolic and therapeutic framework for integrating the unconscious. Without such support, imbalance is almost inevitable. The necessity of humility, perhaps the greatest safeguard against psychological imbalance, is humility. Jung argued that no one can master the unconscious. To believe otherwise is itself a form of inflation. The unconscious is vast, mysterious, and dangerous. Those who see what others do not must approach with reverence as one would approach fire or the ocean. Humility keeps the ego from identifying with archetypal powers. It reminds the visionary that they are not the source of vision, but its vessel. Humility also means accepting limits. Not every vision must be acted upon, not every insight must be shared. Sometimes the task is simply to hold the vision privately until it ripens into meaning. Jung saw this as part of individuation, the ability to live in tension with the unconscious without being consumed by it. The creative potential of controlled imbalance. While imbalance is dangerous, it also holds creative potential. Many of history's greatest works of art, philosophy, and science emerged from individuals who straddled the edge of madness. Jung believed that controlled imbalance, when one allows the unconscious to disrupt consciousness without destroying it, fuels creativity. The visionary dancing on the boundary channels archetypal energy into symbolic form. This is why artists, poets, and innovators often appear eccentric. They are not fully balanced by conventional standards, but neither are they shattered. They live in dynamic tension, translating visions into works that enrich humanity. The danger is ever present, but so is the possibility of transformation. Part 5. The responsibility of the seer. To see what others cannot is not merely a gift, it is a responsibility. Jung believed that the psyche does not grant deeper vision for personal glory, but for the sake of integration, both for the individual and potentially for the collective. The visionary who recognizes hidden truths faces a profound ethical dilemma: what to do with the knowledge. The answer is never simple, for truth can heal or destroy depending on how it is carried. The weight of knowledge. Knowledge itself is morally neutral, but its impact is not. To perceive the collective shadow archetypal forces or unconscious motives is to hold power. Power, Jung insisted, is inherently dangerous. When the ego identifies with knowledge, it becomes inflated. When the ego hides knowledge out of fear, it betrays the self. The seer must walk a narrow path between arrogance and cowardice. The weight of knowledge often manifests as psychological tension. The visionary feels compelled to share, but also fears rejection or persecution. Jung compared this to the myth of Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods to give to humanity. Fire can warm or burn, enlighten or destroy. Prometheus was punished not because fire was evil, but because he disrupted the balance of power. Likewise, the seer must discern when, how, and to whom truth should be given. The danger of premature revelation. Not every truth is meant to be revealed at once. Jung cautioned against premature confrontation with the unconscious. Just as a therapist must carefully pace interpretation, so too must the seer pace revelation. To expose people to shadow material before they are ready is to risk overwhelming them. Instead of integration, resistance and backlash occur. This is why prophets are often killed, reformers exiled, and whistleblowers silenced. They may have spoken truth, but the timing was fatal. Jung understood this. Archetypally, the collective psyche resists sudden change, just as the ego resists sudden unconscious intrusion. The responsibility of the seer is therefore not only to perceive, but to wait to discern the kairos, the right moment when truth can be received. The necessity of translation. Another responsibility lies in translation. The unconscious speaks in symbols, not rational arguments. Dreams, visions, and archetypes do not arrive in plain language. To share them effectively, the seer must translate them into forms others can understand. This requires imagination, empathy, and creativity. Jung himself did this through myth, art, and comparative religion. Without translation, truth remains inaccessible. A seer who speaks only in symbols may be dismissed as mad. One who speaks too literally may terrify or alienate. The responsibility is to find the middle ground, to communicate vision without distortion but also without destruction. This is why so many great seers, poets, artists, storytellers used art as their medium. Art allows truth to be felt symbolically rather than imposed dogmatically, balancing silence and speech. The seer also bears responsibility for discerning when silence is wiser than speech. Jung emphasized that not every vision must be proclaimed. Some truths are meant for private integration, not public declaration. To insist on sharing everything is often a sign of inflation, as if the ego cannot bear to keep knowledge private. Silence is not cowardice. It can be stewardship. By holding certain truths inward, the seer allows them to mature, to deepen, to find their proper form. Jung himself withheld the Red Book from publication during his lifetime, recognizing that the world was not ready. His restraint was an act of responsibility, preserving the integrity of his vision until a time when it could be received. The temptation of power. Every seer faces the temptation to use vision for personal power. Jung warned that archetypal knowledge can be seductive. To know what others do not is intoxicating. It tempts the ego into superiority, manipulation, or even domination. Cult leaders are the most extreme example of this temptation fulfilled. They weaponize archetypal truth to control followers. The responsible seer resists this temptation. They recognize that vision is not theirs to own, but theirs to steward. The archetypes belong to humanity, not to individuals. Humility, again, is the safeguard. Jung argued that the true task is to embody vision, not to exploit it. To live it quietly is often more transformative than to proclaim it loudly. Guiding without forcing. The seer has a responsibility to guide, but not to force. Jung compared individuation to a natural process like the growth of a tree. One cannot pull on the branches to make it grow faster. Likewise, people cannot be forced into awareness. They must be guided gently, symbolically, with respect for their own readiness. This is why responsible visionaries often use questions rather than commands, stories rather than sermons. They open doors rather than drag people through. Forcing vision on the unwilling only breeds resistance. Guiding through invitation preserves freedom and respects the autonomy of the psyche. The ethical dimension of shadow work. The seer also carries responsibility for their own shadow. To perceive the shadow in others is meaningless if one denies it in oneself. Jung insisted that anyone working with the unconscious must begin with rigorous self-examination. Otherwise, the seer becomes a hypocrite, projecting their own shadow while accusing others. The responsibility then is double, to confront one's personal shadow while recognizing the collective shadow. The more clearly the seer integrates their own darkness, the more responsibly they can speak of the darkness of the world. Without this, their vision becomes tainted, distorted by unacknowledged complexes. Protecting the collective from overload. Another responsibility is to protect the collective from psychological overload. Jung knew that societies, like individuals, can only assimilate so much unconscious content at once. Too much revelation destabilizes. The responsible seer paces disclosure, offering enough to provoke growth, but not so much that it triggers collapse. This responsibility is often invisible. People rarely notice what has been withheld, only what has been spoken. But restraint is often the greatest act of care. It ensures that truth once revealed has a chance to take root rather than be burned by the glare of exposure. Bearing the burden of misunderstanding. The seer must also accept that responsibility entails being misunderstood. To speak symbolically is to risk ridicule. To speak carefully is to be accused of cowardice. To remain silent is to be accused of complicity. No path is free of criticism. Jung recognized this as inevitable. Responsibility means carrying the burden of misunderstanding without resentment. The temptation is to lash out, to defend, to demand recognition. but such reactions betray the deeper task. Responsibility requires patience, even endurance of injustice. The seer's duty is not to be liked or understood, but to remain faithful to the vision and to the process of integration. Responsibility is sacrifice. Ultimately, the responsibility of the seer is sacrificial. To carry vision is to carry suffering. Jung pointed out that individuation often involves the archetype of the wounded healer. The seer heals others by carrying wounds themselves. Their loneliness, their rejection, their inner struggles become part of their gift. This sacrifice is not masochism but meaning. To suffer responsibly is to transform suffering into service. The visionary does not escape pain, they transmute it. In doing so, they embody what Jung called the process of making the unconscious, conscious not for personal glory, but for the evolution of the psyche itself. The quiet responsibility of being. Finally, the deepest responsibility of the seer is not what they say or do, but what they are. Jung emphasized that the psyche communicates symbolically through lives as much as through words. A person who lives in integrity with their vision radiates transformation without needing to preach. Their being itself becomes a symbol, a living archetype that inspires others unconsciously. This is perhaps the most difficult responsibility, for it demands consistency. It demands that the visionary embody what they have seen, even when no one notices, even when no one cares. To live authentically, silently, faithfully, that is the ultimate stewardship of vision. Part 6. Transformation turning danger into strength. The dangers of seeing what others do not are undeniable. Isolation, rejection, psychological imbalance, even persecution. Yet Jung emphasized that danger is not the final word. In depth psychology, every peril hides potential, every shadow conceals a seed of growth. The responsibility of the visionary does not end with survival, it extends to transformation. To bear vision responsibly is to convert danger into strength, suffering into meaning, isolation into creative power. The alchemical model of transformation, Jung often turned to alchemy as a symbolic language for psychological transformation. Alchemists sought to turn base metals into gold, but Jung interpreted this as a metaphor for turning base psychic material into spiritual wholeness. The dangers of vision, the loneliness, the shadow conflict, the risk of imbalance are the prima materia, the raw substance. Transformation is the process of containing, heating, and purifying this material until it yields inner gold. The visionary then is like an alchemist. The pain of seeing what others do not becomes the furnace. The archetypal energies are the volatile elements that must be carefully handled. If the process is rushed or uncontrolled, explosion occurs. But if it is endured patiently, what once threatened to destroy becomes the source of wisdom and strength. Integrating the shadow, one of the most powerful transformations comes from integrating the shadow. Instead of projecting darkness outward, the visionary acknowledges it inward. They recognize that what they see in society also exists in themselves. By owning their share of aggression, envy, lust, and fear, they no longer carry vision as a weapon but as a mirror. This integration disarms the collective to some degree. When the seer speaks without self-righteousness, their words carry more authority. They no longer attack from superiority but testify from humility. This humility transforms danger into credibility. The visionary is less likely to be dismissed as inflated, more likely to be heard as honest. Loneliness, as inner strength existential, loneliness, once endured, becomes a wellspring of resilience. To survive seasons of isolation without collapsing teaches the psyche to stand on its own. The individual no longer needs constant validation. This independence is strength. Jung believed that solitude can foster contact with the self, the archetype of wholeness. In solitude, the ego relinquishes its dependence on the crowd and learns to listen inwardly. What once felt like abandonment becomes communion. Loneliness, transformed, becomes the capacity to be alone without despair, to walk through deserts without losing direction. Vision as creative power. Another transformation occurs when vision is expressed creatively. Instead of collapsing under the weight of images and symbols, the seer channels them into art, philosophy, or action. Jung himself painted, sculpted, and wrote extensively during his confrontation with the unconscious. These acts did not eliminate danger, but transformed it into generative energy. Artists across history have done the same. Van Gogh's torment became luminous canvases. Dostoevsky's epileptic visions became novels of profound depth. Toni Morrison's confrontation with collective shadow became literature that healed cultural wounds. Creativity is not escape, it is transmutation. The danger remains, but it is harness-shaped, made useful. From madness to meaning, Jung noted that the line between madness and meaning lies in the ability to symbolize. Archetypal experiences left raw can fragment the psyche, but when symbolized, they enrich it. The seer who learns to treat visions as symbols rather than literal events transforms imbalance into insight. For example, a dream of death can be interpreted as an archetypal message about change, not a literal prophecy. A synchronicity can be seen as a symbolic affirmation of inner alignment, not as magical proof of omnipotence. By holding experiences symbolically, the visionary gains wisdom without being consumed. This is the essence of transformation, to shift from literal danger to symbolic depth. Service as redemption. Transformation also occurs through service. To hold vision selfishly intensifies its danger. The psyche rebels when truth is hoarded. But when vision is offered in service, through teaching, healing, mentoring, it finds purpose. Jung argued that individuation is never purely individual, it always ripples outward. The individuated person contributes to the collective by embodying integration. This service does not need to be grand. It may be as simple as listening deeply to another, offering perspective without judgment, or living authentically in daily life. The strength lies not in dramatic gestures, but in quiet consistency. Service transforms suffering into solidarity, turning private burden into shared meaning. The archetype of the wounded healer. Jung often spoke of the archetype of the wounded healer drawn from the myth of Chiron. The healer does not heal because they are unbroken, but because they have suffered. Their wounds give them empathy, their struggles give them authority. The visionary too becomes a healer, precisely because they have endured the dangers of vision. By surviving isolation, they understand the lonely. By confronting shadow, they understand projection. By enduring imbalance, they understand fragility. Their strength is not theoretical, but experiential. This authenticity transforms them into guides. The very dangers that threaten to destroy them become the foundation of their healing power. Resilience through symbolic living. Transformation is sustained by living symbolically. Jung urged individuals to live as if their lives were myths, not in a literal sense, but in an archetypal one. To see personal struggles as part of a larger story prevents despair. The visionary can reframe suffering not as meaningless pain, but as part of a heroic journey. Symbols provide orientation. The desert becomes not just emptiness, but preparation. The shadow becomes not just darkness, but hidden treasure. Psychological imbalance becomes not just fragility, but initiation. By living symbolically, the visionary transforms chaos into narrative and narrative into strength. Transcending victimhood. A crucial step in transformation is transcending victimhood. The visionary may be persecuted, rejected, or misunderstood, but to remain in victim identity is to remain trapped. Jung insisted that individuation requires claiming agency. The seer must acknowledge suffering without being defined by it. This shift transforms danger into dignity. Instead of saying I am destroyed because I see, the visionary can say I am shaped because I see. The same events are reinterpreted, but the psychic outcome is radically different. Strength arises not from avoiding wounds, but from refusing to let wounds define one's essence. Reconciliation with the collective transformation does not always mean reconciliation with society, but it often includes it. After individuation, the seer may return to the collective in a new way. They no longer seek approval but offer perspective. They accept that not everyone will understand, but they no longer rage against misunderstanding. This calm presence itself is transformative. Jung noted that individuation prepares one to re-engage with the world, not to escape it. The hermit phase, the exile phase, the conflict phase, these are necessary, but they are not the end. The end is to live in the world as a whole person, radiating integration silently. This reconciles the individual with the collective, not through conformity but through authentic contribution. Strength as wholeness. In the end, the greatest transformation is strength through wholeness. Jung defined wholeness not as perfection, but as integration of opposites. The visionary who integrates danger embodies a paradox: lonely yet connected, wounded yet healing, fragile yet strong. Their strength is not the absence of danger, but the ability to hold it consciously. This wholeness radiates outward. It inspires without preaching, guides without forcing, heals without controlling. It is the gold of alchemy, the fruit of individuation, the final transformation of danger into power. Jung believed that this is the destiny of those who see what others do, not to escape danger, but to transmute it into strength that enriches both self and society. To see what others don't is to carry a heavy burden. But Jung reminds us danger and darkness are never the end of the story, they are the raw material of transformation. If you are walking this path, know this: you are not broken, you are being shaped. The world may not understand you yet, but your vision may be the very light it needs tomorrow. Keep going and never stop turning danger into strength.